Silas Blackwood first saw her trying to reason with the freight agent, her back held as straight and unbending as a fence post. He'd heard the talk in Redemption, Nevada, a town that ran on dust and gossip. They called her the Chinese widow, a woman whose husband had been lost in a rock slide at the silver mine the year before, leaving her with a small laundry business in a peculiar affliction. The whispers said she was touched in the head, that she claimed a phantom pain no doctor could find. Silas, a man who preferred the company of his horse to most people, had paid it no mind. But standing there, watching her from across the sun-baked street, he saw it. Her face, usually a mask of calm composure, tightened for a second. Her hand, resting on a crate of lye soap, trembled as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. It was the same look he'd seen on a horse with a stone in its hoof. A deep, private agony it couldn't speak.
The freight agent, a portly man named Barlow with a face like a spoiled ham, waved a dismissive hand. "The price is the price, Leanne. Take it or leave it. I ain't got all day." She gave a slight, formal bow, her body rigid. She paid the man from a small cloth purse, the coins counted out with deliberate care. When she turned to lift the heavy crate, Silas was already moving. He crossed the street in 10 long strides, his worn leather boots scuffing up clouds of ochre dust. "Allow me, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. She startled, pulling back as if he'd drawn a weapon. Her eyes, dark and wary, took him in. A tall, weathered man in a dusty hat, his face browned by the sun and etched with lines that spoke of long miles and open sky. He wasn't like the town men. There was a quiet stillness about him. "It is not necessary," she said, her English precise and clean, with only a faint musical lilt. "I can manage." "It's a hot day for managing," Silas replied, ignoring her protest.
He hefted the crate with an easy strength. "Where to?" She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze flickering from his face to the crate, then back again. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend foolishly. But the sun was relentless, and the crate was heavy, and the pain was a coiled snake in her spine. "The laundry," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Behind the mercantile." He nodded and started walking, forcing her to follow. They moved in silence, the sound of his boots a steady rhythm on the wooden boardwalk. The townsfolk they passed turned to stare. A cowboy and the Chinese widow. It was a sight strange enough to halt conversations and draw eyes from saloon doorways. Silas felt their stares like a physical weight, but kept his gaze forward. He'd spent most of his life on the outside of things. The judgment of a town like Redemption meant less to him than a shift in the wind.
The laundry was a small clapboard building leaning tiredly against the much larger mercantile. The air inside was thick with the smell of soap, steam, and hot cotton. He set the crate down on the packed earth floor. "Thank you," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. She reached for her purse again. "No payment necessary," he said, holding up a hand. He watched her, the way she stood, her weight still carefully balanced.
He decided to step right into the heart of the gossip. "I heard you've been to see the doctor." Her head snapped up, a flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly masked by practiced neutrality. "Town talk is a fast horse." "It is," Silas agreed. "It's also usually wrong. What did Doc Albright tell you?" She looked away, her attention finding a stack of folded linens. "He said it was a woman's complaint, that I imagined it." Silas thought of Doc Albright, a man whose primary medical tools seemed to be a bottle of whiskey for the patient and 2 for himself. "Pain isn't something a person imagines," he said quietly. His own mother had wasted away from a sickness the doctors had called melancholy, a weariness they couldn't be bothered to diagnose. He knew the sting of being dismissed. He gestured to a low wooden bench against the wall. "Is it when you sit?" She flinched, a subtle but profound reaction. It was as if the word itself caused her pain. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her voice was thin, stretched taut. "It hurts when I sit." The simple, declarative statement hit him harder than a shouted confession. There was no plea for pity in her voice, only a stark statement of fact, a truth she had been forced to carry alone. He saw the whole story in those 5 words, the trips to the doctor, the polite dismissals, the daily, grinding agony of a simple act the rest of the world took for granted. "There's another doctor over in Granite Creek," Silas said, the plan forming in his head as he spoke. "They say he's a younger man, trained back east." She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the earnestness in his sun-creased eyes. "It is a day's ride." "I've got a steady wagon," he said, "and the time." "Why?" The question was soft, but it held the weight of 100 others. Why would he, a stranger, offer this? What did he want? Silas thought for a moment. He could have spoken of his mother, of the injustice, but he gave her a simpler truth. "Because I've had a stone in my boot before," he said. "It's a small thing, but it's all you can think about, and it doesn't get better by pretending it ain't there." A long silence filled the steamy room. She studied his face, searching for the trick, the hidden angle. She found none. What she found instead was a quiet belief, a thing more valuable and far rarer than gold. "I will be ready at sunrise," she said. The ride to Granite Creek was mostly silent. Silas drove the wagon with a steady, practiced hand, his eyes on the horizon. Leanne sat beside him on the buckboard, a small, folded blanket beneath her, her posture just as ramrod straight as it had been in town. Any time the wagon jolted over a rock, a small, sharp intake of her breath was the only sound she made. Silas heard every one. He made a point to steer the horses around the worst of the ruts, his movements slow and deliberate. He learned more about her pain from her silence than he ever could have from words. Granite Creek was larger than Redemption, with a 2-story hotel and brick-fronted buildings that spoke of more established money. Dr. Gable's office was on the main street, a brass plaque gleaming on the door. Inside, the smell of carbolic acid and stale air hung heavy. Dr. Gable himself was a man in his 40s, with soft hands and a starched collar that seemed a size too tight. He listened to Silas's explanation with an expression of bored impatience. When Silas finished, Dr. Gable turned his gaze to Leanne, who stood silently by the door. He didn't look at her as a patient, but as an object of curiosity, like a strange bird. "You are the woman from Redemption?" he asked, his tone condescending. "I received a telegraph from Dr. Albright. He mentioned you." Leanne inclined her head. "Yes, sir." "And you have this pain?" he continued, steepling his fingers. "Only when you are seated?" "Yes, sir." He sighed, a theatrical sound of weary expertise. "Madam, I have treated dozens of your countrymen who worked the rail lines. They are prone to exaggeration, a desire for laudanum or a way to avoid work." He didn't even ask her to sit down, didn't ask to examine her. He simply passed judgment from behind his large mahogany desk. "Dr. Albright is a fine physician. If he found nothing, there is nothing to be found. It is likely a matter of the nerves. Hysteria is common in widows." The word hung in the air, ugly and dismissive. Silas felt a hot anger rise in his chest. He had seen men gut-shot and complaining less than this woman who suffered in silence.
"Are you going to examine her?" Silas asked, his voice low and tight. Dr. Gable looked at him as if he were something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "There is nothing to examine. The fee for my consultation is $2. Silas stood up. He walked to the desk, pulled 2 silver dollars from his pocket, and placed them carefully on the polished wood. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "This is for your time," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "But you ain't a doctor. You're just a man with a clean shirt who's afraid to get his hands dirty." He turned to Leanne. "Come on, we're leaving." He strode out of the office without a backward glance, Leanne following close behind. The ride back to Redemption was even quieter than the ride out. The sun beat down, and the failure of the day settled between them like a layer of dust. The hope that had flickered between them had been snuffed out by the doctor's casual cruelty. Silas felt the defeat keenly, not for himself, but for her. He had made a promise to help, and he had only succeeded in getting her insulted by a second, more expensive fool.
They were a few miles outside of Redemption when the rear axle of the wagon, weakened by the hard journey, gave a sickening crack and splintered. The wagon lurched violently, tipping them both toward the ditch. Silas instinctively threw an arm out to steady Leanne, his other hand hauling back on the reins. The horses shied and stopped. The wagon settled at a sharp, undignified angle, its back wheel shattered. "Well," Silas said, surveying the damage with a grim expression, "it seems our luck has run dry." They were stranded. The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was too far to walk back to town before dark, especially for Leanne. He didn't yet know that this broken axle, this frustrating end to a failed day, would be the very thing that finally led him to the truth. There was nothing for it. They would have to make camp. Silas unhitched the horses and led them to a small patch of grass. He pulled a bedroll and a blanket from the lopsided wagon bed. "It'll get cold tonight," he said. "We can build a fire." Leanne said nothing, but watched him with an unreadable expression. He had defended her, had spent his own money on a fool's errand for her, and now was stranded with her in the wilderness. She gathered a few pieces of dry sagebrush for kindling, while he used a small hatchet to break up the splintered spokes of the broken wheel for firewood. As the fire crackled to life, casting a warm, dancing light against the growing dark, Silas saw her shiver. It wasn't just from the evening chill. A deep weariness had settled over her. She stood by the fire, unwilling or unable to sit on the hard ground. "You can't stand all night," he said gently.
He unrolled his bedroll and spread it out for her. "It's not much, but it's softer than the ground." She looked at the bedroll, then at him. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a kindness he rarely showed the world. Here, away from the judging eyes of the town, the air felt different, safer. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the edge of the bedroll, moving with excruciating care. Even with the padding, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her eyes squeezed shut and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Silas sat on his heels across the fire from her. "Tell me," he said, his voice soft. "Tell me from the beginning, not what the doctors said, what you know." She opened her eyes. They were slick with unshed tears. "My husband, Way, he died in the mine," she began, her voice low and halting. "There was an accident with the wagons on the grade. A cable snapped. I was there, bringing him his lunch. The wagon, it broke loose. It did not hit me, but to get away, I fell." She gestured vaguely toward her lower back. "I fell hard, onto the rocks and the track rail." Silas listened, his focus absolute. This was new. She hadn't mentioned a fall. "The doctor, then, he was from the mining company," she continued. "He looked at my arms, my head. He said I was lucky, just bruises. But the pain, it started a week later, a deep ache, like a hot stone inside me. It has been a year." He processed this new information. A fall. A hard impact on rock and steel. Not a woman's complaint. A physical injury. "Show me," he said, his tone still quiet, respectful. "Not to touch, just point, exactly where the center of it is." She hesitated. It was a profound request, an intimacy greater than any she had known since her husband's death. But in the firelight, his face held only a steady, patient concern. She turned slightly, her back to him, and with a trembling finger, pointed to a spot just to the side of her tailbone. Silas's mind, accustomed to the practical mechanics of horseflesh and wagon gear, began to work. He'd seen a horse go down like that, landing wrong on a hard surface. It didn't break a bone, but it drove the muscle and flesh down onto the bone with such force that it created a knot of tissue as hard as wood. It never healed right. The constant pressure of a saddle, or in her case, a chair, would be agony. The doctors, looking for a clean break or a visible wound, would have missed it entirely. They had never listened long enough to understand the nature of the impact. He picked up a smooth, cool river stone from the edge of the fire pit. "Is it like this?" he asked, pressing the stone into the palm of his own hand. "A hard, deep pressure that never leaves?" Her eyes widened. She nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, "that is it." In that moment, the mystery was solved.
not with medicine or fancy degrees, but with patience, with the simple act of listening. He had believed her, and in believing, he had found the truth. Just as a fragile understanding settled between them, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the direction of the road. 2 riders, silhouetted against the last of the twilight. Silas stood up, his body instinctively placing himself between Leanne and the approaching men. As they drew closer, he recognized the bulky frame of Barlow, the freight agent, and one of the rough men who worked for him.
"Well, well," Barlow called out, his voice slick with false concern as he reined in his horse. "Having wagon trouble, Blackwood? And keeping the widow out after dark? The town is starting to talk." His eyes raked over Leanne, then the single bedroll on the ground. The insinuation was as clear as it was ugly. "We had a broken axle," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "We're fine." "I'm sure you are," Barlow sneered. He was the one who owned the building Leanne's laundry was in. His power and redemption came from owning things people needed. "I came to give you some friendly advice. This woman is trouble. She brings shame on the town with her stories. It's not right. Best you ride on and leave her to her own kind." Before Silas could answer, Leanne got to her feet. She stood tall, the firelight flickering in her dark eyes, burning away the fear and deference. For a year she had been silent. She had bowed her head to the insults and the dismissals. But something had shifted by this fire. She had been heard. "Mr. Barlow," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a new authority that startled both Silas and the freight agent. "My husband signed a lease for that building. I have paid the rent every month. It is valid for 2 more years. My health and my company are not your concern." Barlow was so taken aback by her directness, he was momentarily speechless. He had only ever known her as the quiet, bowing widow. This was a different woman entirely. Silas stood beside her, not saying a word, but his presence was a solid wall. He didn't need a gun. The unwavering stillness in his eyes was more potent than any threat. He was a man who had made his stand, and he would not be moved. Barlow looked from Leanne's defiant face to Silas's granite resolve. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward when faced with true strength. He gathered his reins, his face twisted in a frustrated scowl. "You'll regret this, Blackwood," he sputtered. "Both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward town, his hired man trailing behind him like a shadow. They were alone again in the vast, silent dark of the desert. The fire crackled, and the stars emerged, cold and brilliant. Leanne looked at Silas, her expression a mixture of lingering fear and dawning hope. She had spoken up, she had pushed back, and the world hadn't ended. "He will make trouble," she said softly. "Let him," Silas replied. "We'll be ready for it." He looked at her, at the strength he had known was there all along. "Now, let's figure out how to build you a better chair." 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks. In the small line cabin Silas had built in the foothills above Redemption, a new room had been added. The addition was a proper laundry, with deep sinks made of pine, and a large cast-iron stove for heating water. From here, Leanne ran her business now. Barlow had tried to evict her, but Silas had hired a lawyer from Carson City with his own savings. The lease was ironclad, just as she'd said. When Barlow continued to make trouble, Leanne, with Silas's backing, secured the deed on a small, abandoned plot of land, and they built the new place themselves. Inside, the room was warm and filled with a clean scent of soap. Leanne sat at a small table, mending a shirt. She was sitting on a chair Silas had made for her. It was carved from a single piece of dark, polished oak. The seat was split down the middle, like a saddle, with a hollowed-out portion at the back. It was a strange-looking thing, but it allowed her to sit for hours, the pressure completely removed from the injured place at the base of her spine. She sat and moved with an ease that was still new, still a small miracle every day. The town still whispered, of course, but the whispers had changed. They spoke of the cowboy who had built a business with the Chinese widow. They spoke of her quiet resolve, of his stubborn loyalty. The story of Dr. Gable and the $2 had become something of a local legend. Contempt had slowly, grudgingly, turned into a kind of respect. Silas came in from outside, stamping the snow from his boots. He carried an armload of firewood, which he stacked neatly by the stove. He looked at her, sitting there in the comfortable warmth,
her hands busy, her face calm and free from the lines of pain that had been etched there for so long. A quiet contentment settled over him, more profound than any he had ever known. She looked up from her sewing and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that lit up her whole face. "The snow is getting deep," she said. "It is," he said, taking a seat on a simple stool across from her. "We have enough wood, we have enough food. We're ready for it." He watched her as she went back to her work, the needle moving with a steady, rhythmic grace. He didn't need to say anything more. The proof of their victory was right here, in this warm room, in the silence that was no longer filled with pain, but with peace. It was in the simple, beautiful sight of a woman sitting comfortably in her own chair. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.